Hello everybody and welcome back to JoEnglish. Look what I've got for you today. Lots of newspapers from Great Britain. So what I thought would be a good idea is to have an only English lesson where I explain about the different types of newspapers you can find in Great Britain. So this is going to be great for your listening skills and also to learn new vocabulary. Are you ready? Let's go. Hello everybody. So I'm not sure if you can tell, I apologise about my voice today. I have a cold. Can you believe it? It's 35 degrees outside and I have a cold. Anyway. Okay, so when you read a newspaper in Britain, you need to be careful. Don't believe everything you read. I say this because often the same story is reported in very different ways depending on the newspaper. It depends on their style and also on their political stance. In English, we say you need to take everything with a pinch of salt. Now, this means don't believe everything. You need to be a bit skeptical and understand why they are writing in this way. So what I'm going to do today is go through the different types of newspapers we have, what sort of political viewpoint they support, and then we're going to have a look at some of the language that they use. Okay, so one of the types of newspaper we have is called the quality press. Now, these used to be called the broadsheets. Now, the broadsheets, those very big newspapers, but now they are usually printed in a smaller format. But these are very factual-based newspapers. They don't really go in for much entertainment, and they really like to focus on the news. Examples of these could be The Times, The Independent, or The Guardian, for example. Now, these are all really respected newspapers, but be careful, because again, they all have a motive for writing. For example, The Times tends to be more right-wing, so it supports the Conservative government. However, it did support New Labour and Tony Blair in the late 90s. But generally, they're a right-wing newspaper. Whereas The Guardian is traditionally a left-wing newspaper. So again, these two tend to report stories in slightly different ways. Then we've got The Independent. Now, they claim to be independent of any political allegiance, but to be honest, they usually tend to go towards the left. Okay, then we've got what's called the middle market press. Now, these tend to be newspapers that concentrate on a bit of both, factual news, but also entertainment. Examples of this could be the Daily Express. Now, the Daily Express tends to be quite Eurosceptic. So Eurosceptic means very pro-Brexit. And then we've got the Daily Mail. And again, this tends to be more right-wing in its viewpoint. Now, these are the types of paper which have the most readers in general because they tend to take, like I said, a middle ground between factual news and entertainment. Then we've got what's called the tabloid press. Now, a tabloid is literally this format of newspaper, so the smaller style. So even now, the Times, which is a quality paper, is technically a tabloid because of the size it is printed. But when we talk about tabloid press, we tend to talk about newspapers that focus more on sensationalism, that focus more on crime. They might focus more on celebrity gossip. They have big pictures everywhere just to gain the attention of readers. Often, factual news takes second place to the gossip in these newspapers. But again, be careful which one you read. For example, The Sun is very right-wing, whereas The Mirror is very left-wing. They're both tabloids, but they have different political viewpoints. Now, sometimes we call these as well the gutter press. Now the gutter is where on the side of the road all of the rubbish and the water gets pushed into. So this tends to be the type of stories which aren't very factual, there's lots of gossip, and to be honest, they're not completely that well respected. Of all of these newspapers, to improve your English, I would suggest the middle market newspapers because the language they use is good. The journalism is generally good in these newspapers, but the language is much easier to understand. If you go for the quality newspapers, these are good for very advanced learners because they use lots of really detailed and unusual vocabulary, which is great if you're at a high level. And funnily enough, the tabloids, the gutter press like The Sun, are usually the most difficult for foreigners to read. For native speakers, they tend to be the easiest, but they also use lots of puns, which are play on words, which can be very, very difficult for foreigners to understand. An example of a pun is this here. It's found in The Sun, and have a look at the title, Thrown It Out. ITV axes Drama Victoria. Now, ITV is a national television station, and they commissioned a series called Victoria. Now, one of the stars is no longer on it. We have a phrasal verb to throw out, which means to remove. Now, they've taken this phrasal verb and they've made it into a pun, a play on words. Instead of saying thrown, written like this, they've written thrown, which is pronounced in exactly the same way, like this, which is where the Queen sits. So therefore, instead of thrown it out, they've written thrown it out. Again, this is why they're quite difficult to understand. For those of you who follow me regularly, you'll know that I often talk about how language evolves and changes. And this includes new words coming into our vocabulary. An example of this can be found at the moment in Britain, a pingdemic. And this has also been used in a number of newspapers, including here, the Financial Times, which is a very well-respected newspaper. So, what is a pingdemic? Again, it's obviously a play on words to pandemic. When you are pinged, it means you receive a message on your phone. Now, in Britain, the NHS, the National Health Service, sends messages to people if they have been in contact with people who have the virus, telling them they need to stay home and isolate. Now, because the situation has got very bad again in Britain, there is a pingdemic. So many people are receiving pings, messages, that they can no longer go to work. And this is creating problems in the food supply chain. This is the reason they've written it with apostrophes, because technically it's not a word yet, although I'm sure it will become one. Another example of this can be seen here in the Metro. Ping in the army. Again, this is a play on words. Instead of bring in the army, because you bring in the army when you need real help, they've said ping in the army. Because the army is needed due to the amount of people who are receiving pings and can no longer work. So this is why sometimes reading newspapers can be quite difficult. Okay, so if there are some things you don't understand, don't worry. But I really do recommend reading news articles, going onto the websites of some of these newspapers and reading what they have to say. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I'll see you next time.